Yes, thank you so much. And thank you also, Igor. That was very inspiring. And actually, what I find quite interesting is, so I mean, I'm going to take more of a kind of consumer and brand perspective, but actually all the things that you mentioned are the reasons for which the kind of metaverse apps that we're seeing in China right now are working and are popular. So I think it's a really interesting bridge. Anyways, yes, so my background is really thinking more about consumers, people, and kind of cultural drivers for economic consumption. So I wanted to take more of like a consumer and brand perspective and look at, what is happening in terms of the metaverse in China right now, and where are the roots and where could it go? And of course, consumers don't exist in a vacuum, right? They exist in a space where you have policy, where you have culture, and where you have also personal histories. So when we look at where we stand today, I mean, there's various projections flying around. Morgan Stanley sees this as a potentially $8 trillion market. It is growing rapidly, and I mean, it's definitely an important market. And when we look at a government perspective, I think the Chinese government has taken a bit of a wait and see approach. On one hand, they flagged the risks in terms of national security, investment bubbles. But I think as long as the metaverse serves the kind of goals of economic development and also social stability, it will be something that they'll continue to embrace. And the policy is kind of being formed still. On a local government, I think there has been kind of a lot of exploration. So the Shanghai government, for example, has made it part of one of its 5-year plans. There are lots of seminars and discussions going on. And I think, especially in China, it's always quite telling to see what local governments are doing, because that's where kind of all the experimentation is going on. And then, of course, as a last kind of lens or area to look at, private companies are investing quite heavily in the infrastructure, in the software, in the hardware. I think around 16,000 trademark applications within the metaverse have been registered so far. So I think it's definitely a space, consumers find themselves in a space where something is emerging, something is happening. And the metaverse is a really broad term, right? I mean, it means a lot of things right now. And that's also why when we look at what shapes it has taken in China, you see all kinds of things emerging for consumers. So on one hand, you have these kinds of virtual worlds emerging. So one you might have heard of, and which was quite public, was Baidu, who launched Xirang to kind of showcase how their technology to build virtual worlds could work. So they have kind of like a very customizable SaaS platform that they're building to be able to build these metaverse worlds. ByteDance has bought or invested in Pico, a virtual reality headset maker. So, people who have this headset can actually each have their own virtual home and invite other Pico headset users to come and hang out, and they can furnish their home. You also have kind of this whole chain of virtual events. So, for example, in the music industry, one of the leading labels or record labels in China has made kind of digital music and digital idols and musicians part of their kind of strategy for this year. And you already have some music idols like Miro that you see on the picture here emerging. Tencent has launched this first virtual metaverse music festival for people to attend. Gaming, Tencent is hiring a lot for kind of immersive game developers. And of course, also shopping in the metaverse. Alibaba is pushing this quite a lot. And then finally, one thing that I find really, really interesting is this emergence of immersive social apps. So for example, maybe you heard about this, but Zhili actually took over WeChat in terms of the most downloaded app in the Chinese internet at some point. And what's quite interesting about it is that it allows only for 50 users. So it's actually really, you have an avatar, you can interact online, but it's very restricted, and it's about close connections, and it's about real connection online and not just, random people. Equally Soul, which you see kind of in the top middle, is another really interesting case because, again, it's anonymous avatars and you have these augmented reality features. But in the end, what it allows people to do is to connect with people who have similar hobbies, who have similar interests. So once again, right, it's about being able to go online and have real connections with people based on what you're interested in, what you love, or what kind of niche subculture you may be a part of. And I think sometimes we look at the metaverse as if it was, completely new. And I think there is a lot about it that is very new, but it also has kind of a longer history in society, which created these roots or these ingredients. So on one hand, I mean, Igor, of course, you already mentioned this as well, but technology is a really dominant part of life, especially in China. And those lines between real and virtual are already quite blurred, right? So people accept the concept of digital self, the digital value, which of course makes it much easier to then also embrace a metaverse. And virtual selves or idols have existed for many years. So if we go back to the early 2000s, QQ Show was super popular amongst millennials. You might know it, maybe you used it. And then in the 2010s, it became a bit more dominated by real profiles and WeChat, but you still had actually virtual musicians and hologram musicians. And then if you move forward to the 2020s, you also had these more realistic or subculture focused avatars like Taobao Live or Zapato. So I think those ingredients already existed. And the metaverse, of course, builds on top of it and creates a very different kind of space, but it didn't appear in a vacuum. And so I think now this goes back a bit also to Igor's point. So why is the metaverse so appealing to Chinese consumers? I think on one hand, it is a very natural evolution for connection and new kind of social experience beyond WeChat for younger consumers, at least. WeChat has gotten, there's business connections, you have family, you have all kinds of people there, whereas the metaverse, or at least the apps that so far have succeeded, within the space, they allow for much closer connection, a different kind of connection, and actually also maybe a deeper connection through connecting, people through their interests and allowing them to be kind of free of the restrictions that you might have in the real world, right? I think a little bit contributing to it as well is loneliness and social phobia. I think this was accelerated by the COVID pandemic. But amongst some people, they just don't feel comfortable anymore to interact maybe in person, and it's easier for them to be their true self when they are online. And the Chinese metaverse, I think, has very particular characteristics. I think on one hand, of course, government policy is one, and crypto. I mean, Igor, as you mentioned, the metaverse is much more than cryptocurrency. I think in the West, crypto has been quite focused on in the metaverse context. In China, it's not part of it because it cannot be. And I think even digital collectibles have a value that's much more limited. And then, of course, there's also some restrictions on gaming and online content. But then also, I think these subcultures and habits and preferences make the metaverse quite unique, right? So I think we already see Douyin versus Kuaishou. I mean, those are not metaverse apps, those are just social media, but you see actually very different social groups are on Douyin versus Kuaishou. So Douyin tends to be more urban, middle class and above, whereas Kuaishou is quite rural. So I think, as the metaverse emerges in China, you'll also see these kind of different subgroups cluster in different areas or different channels. And then also, and this applies to all metaverses, and again, really goes back to what Igor was saying, I think nobody's going to be on the metaverse just to look at product ads and, be bombarded with paid advertising. I think people are looking for entertainment or something useful. And I think this human connection aspect is really important. And I think for that, if we now take it, from the consumer perspective to the brand perspective, means that brands need to understand these subcultures if they want to, reach consumers there. And when we look at the track record of some foreign brands in China, I mean, I don't know, Dolce & Gabbana and these companies, maybe you saw those scandals, but they have often also gotten it quite wrong, right? And tried to make use of a subculture and then completely confused it, and everybody just ended up criticizing them online. And I think this will again be the same in the metaverse. People need to actually understand it and cannot just copy paste what they're doing in the US and then replicate it in a Chinese context. And so just to kind of round it off, so how have consumers then dealt, or consumer brands dealt with it so far? I think, at least from a brand perspective, the metaverse in China has been seen very much as a marketing opportunity. There's been a lot of collaborations with, for example, Moncler did something with a big art toy company in China, or collaborating with just Chinese celebrities and idols to create collectibles or some kind of marketing. And then something that I find quite interesting and fascinating is also the KOL market. It's large in China, as you know, and so you've also had this emergence of virtual influencers, so completely AI or digital powered avatars that promote brands and events. And here you see just some of these examples. So Taihe is very famous. She's done a lot of work also with Burberry and Guerlain and some of these bigger luxury brands. And quite interesting is that this is also where you see this at least in the marketing world, this real online to offline kind of merging, because on one hand you might have a brand that has a physical event, but then they might have these virtual avatars that usually live in different metaverses and exclusively online. So to conclude all of this, are we ready to digitalize everything? I think definitely there is still a longer road ahead. From a technological point of view, I mean, even Baidu was having a lot of issues with its software, and there is still a technological element that needs to be improved and that will continue to grow and strengthen itself. There's a policy and legal framework which is still being built up. I mean, not just in China, but everywhere. And finally, I think it'll be interesting to see, what will happen after, COVID and the pandemic is over, and what will people look for, or what kind of experiences will they be looking for? As we mentioned at the start of this call, everybody is just so happy to be in person, seeing people again. So I think it'll be also interesting to see how the metaverse will develop. And I think, maybe we'll see more and more kind of also online, offline merging to bring the two worlds even closer together. And that is it for me. But yeah, definitely looking forward to the discussion later. And if you have questions, you can let me know.